Hi folks, my name is Douglas Camp and welcome to the second installment of the Fly Tyers Bench. I'm a member of the San Luis Valley chapter of Trout Unlimited, and this is a project I'm undertaking for our membership and for our webpage. Today I'm going to talk about how to tie the rubber leg Prince Nymph. Now the Prince Nymph has been around for a long time, and it's tried and true, and it's a great pattern, and I hate to dishonor such a wonderful old traditional pattern, but you're going to see how it can be tied differently today. Now, this is what we're going to attempt to tie today. And you'll notice one noticeable difference with this fly, and that is there's not a collar around the fly below or in the back where the bead head ends. I simply tie in the rubber legs and I leave off the collar. Now, many of you will find that very distressing, and I'm sorry, but I even go a few steps further with this fly. Sometimes I use a moose head tail and a red bead head, and sometimes I even forego the peacock curl body and simply use dubbing and the biots and the rubber legs. Now, you probably can or cannot call that a Prince Nymph, but I like to tie all those variations because I think they work. Now, to tie this fly, you're going to need a couple of materials. Obviously, you need a hook. Now, today I'm going to tie this fly on a little bit of a different hook as well, and that's the Mustad 94-840, which is a dry fly hook, a long shank dry fly hook, but has an extra big gap, and the wire is actually not very small at all. It's actually pretty thick as the 3906B extra long shank Mustad Nymph hook or the 9671. But I really like this 94-840 because it's strong, it holds well, and it has the extra large gap. Okay, with the bead head fly, you're going to need to choose between brass or tungsten. I like to use the tungsten beads. And another little bit about beads is when those beads are drilled out, the holes that they drill out to slide onto the hook shank, well, not all companies do them the same ways. Some of them have very small holes and some of them have very big holes. Make sure that you buy beads that have bigger holes, otherwise you're going to spend a lot of time trying to get them on the hook. Even if you pinch the barb of the hook down first before you slide them on, sometimes it's more difficult, especially with the hooks that have smaller gaps. Okay, you're going to need some peacock curl, and peacock curl is a very delicate material. I'm looking to show you an alternative source. If it gets old, it gets even more delicate, and it's hard to work with. So you might even want to try one of the alternative materials, like this diamond midge braid by Hairline. And if you notice, this looks very much like peacock curl. It doesn't have all the little fibers that kind of move and flash. And who knows if fish really see those fibers or not. I assume they do. But it's a whole lot easier to work with. But we're going to use traditional peacock curl today. Now you're going to need material for the ribbing. Once you put that peacock curl on the body, it's very sensitive. It'll break like that. And so you need some ribbing on it to delineate the segments in the body and to make the fly more durable. Most people and most commercial flies utilize flat tinsel, which is kind of like tiny Christmas wrapping ribbon. Some people like to use oval French tinsel, which is another man-made product, and it looks like wire, except it's actually round woven material. Or you can use just good old-fashioned gold wire, which is what I like. And I like to use the brassy size. A size bigger shows more delineation on the segments. And I like to use this company right here, Ultra Wire. Their product comes in lots of different sizes and just a cornucopia of colors. But it's a great product, so I like to use them. Going to need biots. And most of the time, people use goose biots when they tie this fly. Usually they need a dark brown or a black colored biot or a white biot. Goose biots are cheaper and shorter. You can certainly use turkey biots, which I think are generally used more for wrapping quill bodies on dry flies, but I think they cost more. So it's really your choice and what you have and what you want to own. The final thing that we're going to need to tie this fly is rubber legs. And in the first segment, when I was tying the Pat's rubber legs to imitate the larger stonefly species and the ones that are getting mature before emergence, we talked about how I like square-shaped legs because I think they wiggle just a little bit more. It's just an idiosyncratic thing, but I like ones that are square and flat. Now, the ones we're going to use this evening to tie are the Montana Fly Company Barred Sexy Floss Copper Brown in the small size. They make a medium and they make a large, and I really like this product. It's very durable. It's very consistent in color and shape. And oh yes, and thread. Thread is the last thing. And just a uni thread and a size 6/0 works great. Okay. Make sure that you push down the push down the barb on your hook. And I'm going to put my recording prop in place here. We're really a high-tech operation here. We're using the Apple iPhone holder to hold our iPhone in place to record this. I'll try not to look like I'm eating the bead. Yes, it's probably better. Much better. There we go. So make sure you push down the barb on your hook before you put it in the vise, and also slide on your bead, your tungsten bead. This is a 5/32 size. I like my nymphs weighted pretty heavily. Let's start with our 6/0 brown thread. Let's start right behind the bead head and put about a half dozen wraps in, and then go down the shank of the hook about a half dozen wraps, and then come back up another half dozen wraps so that that thread is very firmly in place. Let's cut off the tag end. Now, wrap down towards the bend of the hook. You don't have to completely cover the shank of the hook, but a fairly good coverage works well. Work down to so that the thread hangs down right at where the barb would have been on the hook. Okay? Now, this is our first tricky part of this fly, and that is tying in the goose biots to make the tail. We want the tail to flare out away from the sides of the body. And goose biots, remember, are slightly concave shaped. They have, let me show this on the phone video. They have just a little bit of bend to them. So when you tie them, you want to tie them so that they bend out and away from the body of the fly. So starting on the hook shank, measure that you want the tail to be slightly less than, oh, say, half of the length of the thread that you tied in. Start by tying the goose biot in too long with 2 wraps. So we're going to pin it here against the shank of the hook with my finger right here and wrap the thread around 1 time and 2 times. Now when you first do this, it's going to take some practice and it's going to take some patience. The goose biots are difficult. It just is. But if you look and see that tail is not excessively too long, I'm going to pull it up just a little bit, just a smidge. Now I'm going to put more thread wraps if it's where I want it to be. 1, 2. Okay. Now let's add the second goose biot on the near side. I always like to start with legs, biots, tails with the one that's away from me. I don't know why. No one taught me that. I didn't read that in a book. That's just what I like to do. But here's our goose biot. Remember, it's concave. We want it to curve away from the body. We can tie it in too long and shorten it in just a second. 2 thread wraps. Well, look at that. That's almost even. You'd think I'd tied this fly before. Now we're going to put a few more thread wraps on. Position it one more time. Now, see all of this extra goose biot up here? Don't cut that off. Just take your thread and wrap up the shank of the hook and use that biot material to build up the thickness of the body, and then come back down about halfway. Any of that goose biot that's sticking up, you can just very carefully snip off with your scissors, because it will get in the way if you don't. All right, time for copper wire. Take your piece of copper wire. This is gold copper wire. And I start by tying it in on the top, but then I quickly bring it over to the side and wrap the thread all the way down to the goose biots. If you wrap the thread too far down, the goose biots, which you spent time tying in, spread out, will all of a sudden be closed. So be very careful about how far you wrap that thread down. All right. Time for peacock herl. As you tie this fly, you'll begin to understand how many peacock herls you need to tie in because of the thickness of the herl themselves and because of the length. I've determined with this peacock herl that I have here that I need at least about a half dozen herls. But I have some other herls that I tie with in a different place, and those herls only need about 4. So it's a matter of knowing your product and experimenting. So you can always tie in too many to begin with and then pull them out or cut them off. I try to get all the tips basically in one place. Now I don't need worry with cutting them off because I'm going to tie a big chunk of this in to help build up the girth of the fly along the hook shank. So I lay them on top of the hook shank. That one's trying to escape. Like so. Pinch the thread around the fibers, and then I start wrapping them up the hook shank. And sometimes you have to grab them and push them down. It doesn't have to be pretty because you're just going to wrap more peacock herl on top of these. And leave the thread right up here behind the bead head. Now when you start to wrap the peacock herls forward, don't do the whole bunch at once or you're going to have a catastrophe. Break it down into at least 2 groups of peacock herls or even 3 groups of peacock herls. I'll do it in 2. You start right behind that nice goose biot tail, and then you start wrapping it forward. This first bunch of peacock herls doesn't have to really be anything other than covering the hook shank. In other words, you don't have to shape it like you would any other normal nymph to begin with. Let's tie that off. What am I talking about? Let me explain it with a visual. Almost all the nymphs that we tie to some degree start out very small and gradually get bigger and bigger and bigger. Sometimes we refer to that as a carrot shape. On this fly, that's not quite as important, but we do want it to get somewhat bigger as you wrap the peacock herls towards the bead head. So on the second group, I start wrapping much quicker forward so that when I get up behind the bead head, I have lots of extra peacock herl to wrap around and build a little bit of the bulk of the fly. And then I tie it off. Make sure you tie that peacock herl in pretty well. What I mean by that is more wraps, not tight wraps. Tight wraps will sometimes break the peacock herl off and it'll all unspin. Okay, now we take our gold wire and we come right in behind that goose biot tail, and we start segmenting the body. You can segment it as much or as little. That's your choice. Since it's a nymph, you don't have to worry about the weight. But what you should worry about is when you get up here to the brass or the tungsten bead head that you wrap the wire around twice before you tie it in so it will not slide. Here we go, we're wrapping it in once, twice, 3 times. All right. Remember when you cut wire with your scissors, if you only have a couple of good pairs and not a junk pair, you go all the way to the very back. See how these scissors actually have a little place to cut wire and stuff? Snip that wire off, push it down if it's sticking out. All right. If you were going to tie in the collar for this fly, for the traditional Prince Nymph, this is where you would add the collar, where and when, right here behind the bead head. And I'm not going to do it, sorry. But I am going to add the rubber legs because I think those rubber legs are super, super sexy and, as the name implies, and really attract the fish. Now I like to take a whole strand of rubber legs and simply cut it in half, which I've done here. Then cut it in a half again so that you have 2 shorter strands. And then take these 2 shorter strands and one at a time, cut them in half. Here's the loop I'm going to use to produce the legs. Take the rubber legs and center them. Hold them in place and use your thread wraps. 1, 2. Now you see how those legs really jumped out to the side and they almost don't look right? That's because I've created a huge space between the tungsten bead and the peacock herl. So I need to add, probably a half dozen thread wraps to build that up. Now let's try to tie those legs back in again. Okay, they're still splaying out, but not at such a great angle. And I like this much better. Try to get them exactly the same length by tugging them. Remember, if you tie these rubber legs in too long, then you can simply take your scissors and nip them to size. And that's what I do pretty often. Now I'm going to add a couple more thread wraps. They're still kind of jumping out, aren't they? We'll have to live with that. Now we're going to do the second leg. Remember, this is a quartered piece of rubber leg material. Now we're going to cut it into 2/8. Going to rotate this up so you can see it. I'm going to lay those legs right here on top. Take my thread and pinch it in my fingers and then wrap it around once. Let's do that again. Once. Twice. Okay. Now I'm going to tighten it. I'm going to see if I can't get about the same angle as on the other set of legs. Now one of these legs is, yeah, look at that. It just ran away. We've got to pull it back in place. Try it again. Now. Got some funky legs going on today. The fish probably don't care if the legs come out at the same angle, but those of us that are fly tying junkies do. So we wrap some thread behind some of the legs on the side that doesn't stick out as much. We play around with it a little bit. We just keep adding some thread. And we know right now that we're not going to make it look perfect, but that's okay because ugly flies catch fish and pretty flies catch fishermen. Now we're ready to tie in those white goose biots. This is one of the most distinctive parts about this fly is the white biots on the top. Now remember, those biots are concave, so you want to tie them in such that they start going up and then they go back down. If you start to tie these biots in and they pop up in the air, then it's just like the legs. You need to add a little more thread to close the gap between the peacock herl and the bead head. So here we go. I'm tying the first one in, and I want the goose biot to be about the length of the body. But I have seen them and used them all lengths. Sometimes the goose biots are really long. Sometimes they're little nubs. I don't know, but I like it the length of the body, so that's what I'm going to teach you on this video. So I've got that goose buyout where I want it to be. And those goose buyouts need to flare a little bit on the top too. They need to make a V just like on the tail. It's just the V needs to be flat on top of the fly. So I tie them in right in the center, right behind the gold brass bead or the tungsten bead. But then I want them to shoot away from the body a little bit. Let's do the second one. Make sure I get the concave the right direction. Lay the goose buyout on top of the fly. Wrap it around once, twice. Okay, that looks like about the same length, and it makes a nice V. Let's keep adding some thread wrap so it doesn't slide around. And on this fly, this is one fly where you really can't add too many thread wraps. It's important to have those thread wraps to hold those little goose buyouts in place and they don't run away. So I'm adding plenty of thread wraps. Now I'm going to bend the part of the buyouts I don't want up and use my scissors and carefully clip the buyouts without cutting the rubber legs. And if you have a little bit of material left on top, that's okay. Nobody's going to not eat your fly because that is there. Wrap a few more thread wraps in. There we go. And finally, take your whip finisher and whip it off. 1, 2, 3. Again, cut your thread without cutting your rubber legs. Okay, there's the finished product other than glue. Now's your time to straighten the legs a little bit more. I would not mess with the goose buyout right now because it'll come off and then you'll say bad words. I'm going to take my scissors and just try to get a little bit more of the buyout by the brass bead trimmed up. And then I am going to put my head cement liberally on the top and on the bottom. And my friends, this is the Prince Nymph minus the hackle collar with rubber legs. It's a very deadly fly on streams and large rivers where there are populations of smaller mayflies and where there are populations of bigger populations of smaller stoneflies and populations of bigger stoneflies that are in their immature size. And don't be afraid to tie variants using different color buyouts and different color body materials. All right, this is Doug Camp. Thank you for watching my video. Thank you for supporting Trout Unlimited if you do. And I'll see you next time for the Rusty Midge.